Hello. This week's video actually has a little more of a purpose than the last couple. It's actually supposed to be the beginning of the creative process for a piece of writing that I'm planning on doing in the near future, just about geek culture, or whatever you want to call it, and its perception and portrayal in the media, and how much has changed over the past decade or so. Because I realize that I have a lot to say about it, but I've never really written about it, or honestly vocalized it too much, and so I sort of wanted to start getting that out there, and this to be the beginning of that. But what I want to talk about right now is a subject that has been brought on by a blog post that recently made the social media rounds by a prominent comic book author who made some ridiculously sexist comments about cosplayers at conventions. He was talking about a particular convention. It became this whole tirade about women in comic book and general nerd culture and how they just want attention and a lot of ridiculous stuff. Basically, calling to attention something that has been a subject of discussion for a while, but particularly recently, about how a lot of geek stuff has just become more mainstream, much more mainstream in the past few years, and because it's generally drawing a lot more people in, it's also drawing in a lot more women. And there's now a much stronger female presence in what was at least always perceived to be, it's debatable whether it ever was, but what was always perceived to be sort of a boys' club, sort of a male-dominated culture. And a lot of people, unfortunately, besides that comic book artist, a lot of people have made the same sort of argument that women get into these things, they get involved in conventions and cosplay and different fandoms because they want attention, because they know that, or at least, it's perceived as a more male-dominated thing, and so they figure that they won't have a lot of competition for the attention of a lot of men who are stereotypically sort of sexually repressed and frustrated, and obviously a lot of that is unfounded, and ironically, people making those sorts of accusations tend to make them from a place of sexual frustration and psychological issues, but none of that is valid, obviously. It's just something that has been discussed a lot recently, and I suppose I wanted to add myself to the discussion as well. But really, one of the things that I found most interesting that comes up in discussions about such things is, for lack of better terminology, this sort of before it was cool conundrum, wherein people tend to get accusatory of other people in certain fandoms because of the way they got into whatever the fandom is for. A really easy example is the Avengers, the recent movie, and all the movies leading up to it, because Marvel Comics has seen a giant surge in interest and fandom in the past few years, largely because of the Avengers and the movies that led up to it. And you have a lot of people that are becoming more interested in Marvel Comics and general Marvel media because they saw the movies and they got into it that way. And like I said, this is just an example. It's applicable to a lot of other things, but you inevitably get this sort of attitude by a lot of people who are not necessarily physically older, but who are older fans of a certain thing, being condescending and judgmental of people that have gotten into their fandom via the more accessible outlet. And what I realized, and it seems obvious, but listen, what I realized is that those sorts of feelings, those sorts of judgmental accusations are completely unfounded. And as I said, that seems obvious when you put it that plainly, but it almost surprised me, thinking about it, how much I've been guilty of that behavior. And because in your head, it does seem valid. It's sort of the delusion that your fandom of something, your respect and adoration for some creation by whatever author is more valid and carries more weight because you got into it a different way, and usually a more obscure way, and you're therefore superior in some fashion to the people that got into it via the more accessible route, i.e., as I said, people who have been reading Spider-Man comics since they were kids, who saw the movies and got into the movies because they liked the comics, sort of looking down on people who did it the other way around, who got into the comics and got more interested in that sort of thing in general because they like the movies. And I think I'm not the only one that, to a lot of people, on the surface, that does seem valid. There doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with it, but there is. It's really arbitrary, and it's not based in anything. And I just think that it's funny how hard it can be sometimes to realize that. And as I said, speaking about it in such simple terms, it seems obvious and it seems silly, because it is silly, but I think you need to examine it and examine yourself a little bit to realize how silly it is. But I suppose all I'm really trying to say here is that it doesn't matter how you got into something, it matters that you got into something. And no matter what entrance you took into it, and the entrance somebody else took into it, they arrived at the same place you did. And that's the important thing. And it's just interesting to consider how difficult it can be to come to that realization, and how much people cling on to their sort of iron, sacred fandom when there's really no reason for it. So, I suppose it's food for thought. It certainly was for me. And that's probably all I have to say this week. So, I'll see you later.